Hi guys, welcome everyone. We're starting our second office hours session. I will be sharing my screen momentarily, and we'll get started. Backendless Office Hours today. Well, as in any other office hours session, the agenda is we're going to have a topic of the day, where we talk about a feature or some best practices. And then we go into questions and answers part of the office hours. Please feel free to use the chat pod in Zoom to ask any questions. I received a few questions via email. They were rather complex to handle it here. I think better medium for those would be a support forum, because it will require some back and forth interaction. Nevertheless, for other simpler questions that I received, they were coming down to what we're going to have as the topic of the day, which is data binding. And data binding here, it's going to be in the context of UI Builder. It's one of the core elements of developing UI Builder applications. And the better you understand data binding, the better and faster you'll be able to build your UI Builder applications. Data binding is really kind of one of the main channels that exists within your application to enable data flow and updates on the screen and so on. But hopefully that will become apparent as I go through my presentation. And this is going to be the kind of presentation where I will jump from the slides into UI Builder, just to demonstrate various concepts that exist specifically within the realm of data binding. Okay, so if we take a look at the layered structure of a UI component being present on the page, then for any UI component, there will be a data model. And even if you did not create a specific data model, there is going to be one, because a UI component by itself is nothing just by a thin veneer that knows how to render data and render itself with various visualization mechanisms, being color or paddings or margins or size of the font and so on. And of course, there is data or some behavior. But the actual mechanism for providing information to that UI component and then basically enriching it with data is what we call data model. Now, let's kind of dissect these three layers. And here it's going to be mostly just two layers, UI component and data model. And let's dissect and see what they are in order to start understanding the actual data binding. So with UI component, and if you take any UI component, simple or complex, and the simple ones could be something like, a text label or a button or select going to be more complex, but still any UI component, it will have its own properties. And properties may control either visual aspects of that component, and it could be something like visibility. It's basically a property that dictates whether that component should be shown on the screen or not. Or it could be a data carrying property, such as, let's say, content property for text label. And the individual properties for UI components, they can be mapped to data model. And we will explore what that actually means and what the benefit of this is and why you would want to do this. Now, as far as the actual data model, first of all, you need to understand that it is an object. And understanding what objects are is going to be rather crucial. And for this, I recommend going to our Codeless Fundamentals course that are recorded, that is on our YouTube channel. And we spend a fair amount of time talking about objects. But any object, including the ones that are data models, they consist of name, value, data pairs. And you can define what those data pairs are. You can define what the names of the properties are and what data goes in there. And then the cool thing about the actual data binding is that whenever you have data model and then and a UI component sitting on top of this, and then UI component sort of tuned into data model and you establish that mapping, and I will demonstrate how that works in UI Builder. Anytime the data model changes, whether a new property is declared in data model or an existing property is updated in data model, then UI component that sits on top of it and is linked to that data model will be re-rendered. And that is one of the most crucial things to understand in UI Builder. And it's the roots of it come from React programming. So because whenever you build a UI Builder application, you come up with a React app. And then in React, that's basically how it works. So whenever your data model is updated, UI is being re-rendered. And based on this, you can use it to your advantage to make very dynamic applications. So let's take a look at not a specific example yet, but still in the slides. So let's say we have a UI component that has a property visibility, and pretty much every single UI component that you will find in UI Builder will have property visibility. And then the value of that property could be, you could just specify that it's always visible, or you could make it dynamic whether you want to show that component or not based on some other criteria. And in order to provide that dynamics where that component is, sometimes it is visible, sometimes it is not visible, you implement it by establishing a mapping of that UI component's visibility property to a data model. And what you do is you say that the value on the UI component side for the visibility property is bound to some other property in data model. And then here's our data model. And let's say that this property is called show my UI. So whenever data model show my UI property is updated, and let's say that the value becomes true, then the UI component will be re-rendered and it will become visible because the underlying value is true. Now, if you update the data model and you set the value of this show my UI property to false, then the UI is going to be re-rendered, and then this component will become invisible because the underlying value is false. So this may sound complex. However, inside of UI Builder, it actually becomes fairly straightforward. So let me jump into UI Builder and I will demonstrate this specific example in action. Okay, so here is my UI Builder. Let me move this zoom thing out of the way because it's kind of blocking some parts of the screen. So here, what we will do is, let's say we will take text. All right, so here's our text component, and let's position it nicely on the screen, and we will put it right in the middle. By the way, to do this, what you need to do is you go into margin and you set top and bottom to auto, and then center the actual content. In this case, I will do it like this. So the text is now centered, and I will just give it a larger font size. So here's our text. Okay, so let's explore, and this is our UI component. So let's explore what properties it has. So if you go into logic, anything that has this text field, these are going to be properties. So we have the properties that is class list, styles, visibility, and content. So these two, class list and styles, can control just anything that can be used to style that component or position it actually. Visibility controls the visibility, and content controls what's shown in that component. So now with visibility, this is what I was talking about in the slides. Let's stick to visibility. Let's say that we want to create the logic where every second component becomes visible, and then the next second it becomes invisible, and it's just cycled back and forth, right? So the visibility logic or the visibility property we will bind to a property in data model that will be called show my text. All right, so this is really just the name of the property that will be in data model. Right here, right under this field, you will see text that says bind property value from the page data model. This is extremely important because it tells you which data model will be used for this visibility property. The reason it does this is because you could have multiple data models. And we will get to that a little later in my presentation. But in this case, it tells you that it's going to be the page data model, meaning the data model for the entire page will be used here by this visibility logic. And inside of page data, this property is what my component is tuning to say that anytime this property changes, the visibility will be reevaluated. Okay, so show my text. Let's remember this. Now, if we go back to the page, and then I will select the page itself, and I will add logic for the page. So here's page, and in the on page enter, I will create a timer that will run every second. Okay, so every 1,000 milliseconds. And what I will do is this. So I will set the property in page data. All right, so this page data now refers to the data model that is used by our label. And then remember that the property was show my text. Okay, so if I set the value to true, then the text label will be visible. If I set it to false, it will become invisible. So what I will do is I will add the logic that will basically revert that value. And it's going to look like this. So I'll put not, and then get property, show my text from page data. So I'm taking what's in there and I'm reverting it and I'm putting it back into page data. So that's kind of this little trick to modify the existing value. So if I run this page now, this timer will start and it will set the value to true or false every second. As a result, you see this text, it starts blinking. So 1 second, the visibility is true, it is shown, and the next second, the visibility is false, it is not shown. Okay, and then here, notice that, I'm gonna turn it off. Notice that if we go to our text label, the only thing that we needed to do here is to assign the property in the data model that the visibility property of the UI component is tuned in. Okay, so as soon as the value of this property in the data model changes, then the component is re-rendered and it gets new value for the visibility. Now, since we are using page data, if I were to have some other components sitting on that page, it means that as soon as I modify this page data, it's not just the text label that will be re-rendered. It's the entire page that will be re-rendered because page data is a data model for the entire page. That's something to keep in mind. All right, let's go back to my slides and continue. Now, in the example that I demonstrated, my value for the visibility property was tuning into a property in data model. Sometimes, and quite often, you may not just be able to assign the property in data model. You need to add some logic that will run whenever page is being re-rendered. So that logic actually will run anytime when the data model is modified. Exactly as with re-rendering, but in this case, it gives you a place to add the logic where you can do some additional checking and control aspects of your UI component. So it sounds complex, I understand that, but let me demonstrate this in action and you will see exactly what I'm talking about. So let me create a new page and I will call it data binding with logic. And in here, what I will do is I will, first of all, let me describe the actual example. So if I go to the backend, I do have a table called country. And in this table, I have various properties such as continent and the name of the country and the year when it got independence. But in our case, let's focus just on the property name, which is the name of the country, and the continent. And you will see why. So if I go back to the front end, the logic is going to be as such where I will retrieve a list of all the countries. And then if any given country is in, let's say, some specific continent, I will want to highlight it with a different background color. Okay, so that will be the actual example that I want to implement. So for this, what I will do is drag block. Okay, and then this block I will mark as repeater. So this block will render all the countries that we're fetching from the database. And then I will add a text into my block. And then this text will display the name of the countries. Okay. So for now, step number one, and right now there is no logic that we assign to the actual property. Right now, we're just going to setting up what we're going to do here. So first of all, for the page itself, let's add logic to fetch data from the database. Okay. And for this, what I will do is I will set, and I should have renamed my block, but let's just keep it like this. So the block that is repeater is going to be block. So I'm fetching data from the database, and it's going to be table is country. Okay. And let's just say we're going to get maximum 100 records. Okay. And the actual text right here, I will use data binding for content, and I will bind it to property name. Okay. And this is already, we're doing what we have done before, but I will clarify what is happening here. By the way, let's actually rename our blog and call it countries. Okay. So first of all, the name of the country. So this is going to be the text. Actually, let me run it just so you can see what's going on, and I will describe what I have done. So at this point, I'm getting all the countries, well, 100 countries from the database, and they're being rendered right here. What has just happened? So this block is repeater, which means that any UI components that it has inside are going to be used as templates, and they will be re-rendered and repeated and for everything that was loaded from the database. And then what I loaded from the database are the countries, and I assigned this collection. So this block returns a collection. I assigned this collection as the data for my repeater called countries. So that means that this block gets the collection of all the countries. And then for every single country, I will be rendering this text block over and over as basically just repeated because it is repeat. Now, the actual text component uses name property as the content logic. Notice that it says bind property value from the country's repeater item data model. Okay, so the country's repeater, the data model is a collection of the countries. Every single country has a property such as name, continent, independence year, everything that we saw in the table. So every single column in the table becomes a property in the individual object. So here I'm binding it to name, and that's what we got. Now, what we were discussing in the presentation is that we can actually execute some logic, all right? And then the logic that I want to execute is for any country that, let's say, is in North America, I want to highlight it with a different background color. So how can we do this? Well, first of all, we can use this styles logic to modify the style of individual text. Notice that we are in the text component. So in the styles, we can either bind to a property, but in this case, we don't really have a property to bind to say, hey, use red color or whatever color. We actually have to analyze whatever that object has to make a decision what to show. So let's add logic for the styles And in here, notice that we have this countries repeater data item. And this will be in any given country, so specific country. And it will be in this logic will be executed as many times as there are countries in our repeater. So in here, we will add logic that will say, that will look like this. So I will get the continent property from my data item. And if that continent property equals North America, then what I want to do is I want to return a style that will be, let's say, background color red. And for this, I can just create an object here and call that style. It's called background. And the value will be red. And this is standard CSS. So background is a CSS property, red is a value for the background property. And then just by doing this, what I did is I modified the styles property of my text with some logic, okay? And then the logic is basically this. And if I rerun this page, you see that now for every country that is in North America, it has different background color, okay? And that's exactly what I was describing right here, where individual value could be mapped to logic. And in this case, the value of the styles property in the UI component is driven by the logic that I associated with that property, okay? Before I go any further, I want to see if there are any questions in the chat. No, there are no questions. So let's just continue. All right. And to move forward, let's run this. Okay, so we talked about, whether property is specific value. We talked about whether value of a property can be logic. And then the next thing. So whenever you have a data model for a component, the same data model can be used for multiple components. And that's where things could become very interesting, because when on your UI, when something changes in one component, you may need to display different data in another component. And it's quite common where, let's say you have a filtering option for part of your UI where you selected something in a drop-down list and you want to update other drop-down lists just to create the filtering. Or if you selected a specific item somewhere and you want to modify other parts of the UI on the same screen. And that's how you can do it, by reusing the same data model to provide the channel of for the data flow. Okay, let me demonstrate this specific example that we have here, where we could have an input field and a text label using exactly the same data model. Okay, and for this, I will create another page. We'll call it input and text. So let me drag a input component, and I will also drag text component. And then the idea here is that anything that I type in the input component, I want to automatically replicate in the text component. Now, the cool thing is with this example, it would require literally no logic, just the assignment of the data binding. So for the input component, if I go to the properties, notice that the value, by the way, input component has a bunch of properties. As you can see, they are class and styles, as we saw, visibility, but you can control label, value, placeholder. All these properties can be controlled through data binding. What we care about in this example is the value. So the value is whatever's typed in the input component can be mapped to the data model. Okay, so I will call it input value. And the way this works is that anything that I type in the input component will automatically go into data model. Okay, so it's not just from data model into the UI. It is actually, it works backwards as well. So what this assignment does is that whenever input component is modified by the user, the underlying data model, which is page data, is also modified. And in there, there's going to be a property called input value. Now, if I go back to the page and I select my text component has content logic, and I put in the same input value. So at this point, both input and text are pointing to exactly the same property in the page data model. And by doing so, if we run this page and I start this as a test, start typing something in here, notice that it is automatically, this is my text component, it is automatically modified in there. So for every single keystroke, it is automatically replicated. And then this is done instantly without any additional logic programming, simply just by using the assignments of the mapping between UI component property and the underlying data model property. So this is very important to understand, that you can actually do this and use it to your advantage. Okay, let me go back to my presentation. So I demonstrated this. All right, actually, before I go further, what I wanted to do is in the spirit of this sort of demonstrates and really demonstrates that data binding can flow both ways, from component to data model and from data model to component, okay? And to further demonstrate this, we could actually say that the same data model property, and in this case, it is called input value, I think, can be modified by any part of your application. It's not just only this UI component that can modify it. It can be modified by timer. It can be modified by an incoming request into your application through, let's say, real-time database. Really, any part of your application can make that change. And then to further demonstrate this, I will replicate this input component. I will make a couple of copies. And then so now we have 3 UI components and a text label. And let's make sure that all 3 UI components are bound to exactly the same property. So here it's called input value for the first one. And I will select the second and also put for the input value. I think it replicated all of them exactly the same way. And then here input value. So now we have 3 components and a text label. If we run this page, and notice that I can pick any one of them and start modifying. Okay, so now all 3 are really displaying exactly the same data, regardless which one I select. Okay, and they're instantly updated. So which means that the data binding is bidirectional and can be modified by anyone, and it will update all UI components that are bound to that property. Okay, so that's what I wanted to highlight in this example. Now, let's go back to the presentation, and I want to show one other thing. So here, in any given UI application, typically you will have multiple zones. Like this is kind of a schematic visualization of an application where you have something related to the user and main content and some additional selections, right? And then if you dissect this UI, then you could actually see that these may be specific UI zones. And then each of these UI zones may have its own data model, okay? In fact, this is what's recommended, only because if you were to make a change to this zone data model 1, then only this part of the UI will be re-rendered. And re-render is something that is very important, and you should not take it lightly, because if you have a lot of re-rendering, it will make your UI slower. And if it is slower, of course, it will impact user experience. And then user experience is something that you should really, really care about. And By breaking it down into zones and assigning different data model to these zones, you can actually control when any given part of the UI will be re-rendered. What we see quite often is that people, when they build UI builder applications, they go straight for page data. And that's right, page data is there, and so is app data. In fact, app data is the data model that sits under all UI pages. And when you put something into the app data, it is guaranteed to be there for regardless which page is being rendered. But if you put something into page data, then the entire page will be re-rendered whenever page data is modified. And then for busier UIs, especially if you have a lot of different UI elements, having specific data models for individual zones would be very, very important. And the question is, how can you accomplish that where individual part of a UI has its own data model? Now, in order to do this, if we go back to UI Builder and take a look at the components that are basically the container level components. And for this are going to be blocks. So here we have block. Let me just give it a slightly different background color just so we can see them. So this is block, and we can replicate this block and just give it a different background color. Okay, so this block may have some other additional components, and you can lay it out on the screen where it will have different components. So let's say if in our example, this could be one block, another block, and the third block, right? And then they contain their own data. So in order for this block to have its own data model, all you need to do is to set it as the data container, okay? And as soon as it's a data container, then this guy will have its own data model and you can update it separately, okay? However, if it is a repeater, then it's automatically a data container. So anything that is a repeater has its own data model, and that's the collection of data that is being repeated, okay? If something is not a repeater, because you may have this block that contains a repeater inside, then just mark it as a data container and it will have its own data model, okay? Same thing goes for the container component. And the container component may have one or more rows, and then individual rows may have one or more cells. So if you select the actual container, notice that it has checkbox data container. By selecting it, you're basically instructing UI Builder and tell it that this container, UI container component, has its own data model. And by properly assigning individual data models to your components, you can create kind of a structure where you prevent re-render on parts that should not be re-rendered whenever data is being modified. Okay, so that's what I wanted to describe here. All right, so that's all I have prepared on data binding, and let's take a look at any questions that we may have at this point. So one question is or more on the styling. And the question is, where can I find all the properties that can be modified? Background color, text color, and so on. So a couple of things. So first of all, with the components that are built in, okay? And then, well, built in, there are components that are provided here. Every single component has a ton of different properties that can be styled and modified. To understand and to know what those individual properties are, if you go into theme, okay, so this is the theme, and if you select editor, then in here you will find this icon that says open SDK style. So when you click on this is going to be a very long file, okay, and in here you'll find the style definitions for every single built-in components. There are also variables like these at and then something. These are variables that apply for the entire page. Understanding CSS and less with UI Builder is important when it comes to styling and providing unique look for your applications. So this is something that you really need to invest some time to understand how CSS works. If you're looking for styles of specific component, let's say it is data table. So if you just search for data table, okay, so here it is, component data table. Everything that is in here, like all these properties, they apply to the built-in data table component. And with these ones, you can modify by creating an extension, you can modify any of these properties. So that's as far as the styles that are built in, okay? For everything that is not built in, UI Builder supports complete CSS. And CSS has standard components that apply to what can be rendered on the HTML. There is a gazillion number of resources on the internet where you can learn about individual components. And that's and all of those apply directly to UI Builder. So if you just start Googling CSS, just start with CSS and then go from there, and you will be able to narrow it down. So that's what I would recommend. All right, so how to define a color like light blue, not the primary. So let me just demonstrate this. So for this, I will create some other page, and I will just say color demo. In fact, you know what? How about we go to our landing page where it has this text, and let's just modify the color of this text. So in here, first of all, you see this classes, okay? And how about we add a class, call it my text color. Okay, so now it has this class, my text color. And then if we go to theme, let's create an extension and call it my extension. And in this, we will define my text color class. So this is the syntax of CSS. And for text properties, the property is going to be color. And then if we want something that you said light blue, in here there's an icon that opens the color picker. So if you go to the blue, here's the, I don't know, looks like blue. So you just click copy and put it in here. So now we have this my text color. And if we go back, it is already updated, and it is this light blue. So just by running this page, we'll see that we'll have our blinking text in, for some reason, it is not light blue, or is it light blue? For the sake of time, I'll investigate, and in next office hours, I'll update and let you know why it did not render properly. I'm curious. Something is not right here. I'll figure it out, but let's move on. Is there a way in UI Builder to have a border on each repeater container? You can definitely assign a border. Like for instance, if we go back to the data binding with logic, all right, so this is our repeater container. And in here, you can just assign a border on this block in the decorations. So we just say, the border is going to be 2 pixels, solid, and, bright red. Okay, and if I run it, then I will have a border. There you go. So now if we have this border, you can see around the entire repeater. So you can do it either in the border definition for the actual component right here in the styles editor, or you can do it with CSS in the extensions. So that is definitely possible. All right, next question. I wonder about both checkboxes being independent on the repeater and data container. Perhaps they should be exclusive and maybe name them repeater data container and single data container. No, I don't think they should be exclusive. Here's my block, okay? And this block is marked as repeater, okay? Whenever you have something as repeater, it will be a data container. So what happens is they're not exclusive, but whenever you mark something as repeater, the data container check mark becomes really redundant. Okay, whether you check it or not, it will not make any difference, because by selecting something as a repeater, it will get its own data container. Okay, if you don't have it as repeater, but you assign it as data container, it will get its model, it will get its data model, but it will not function as a repeater. Okay, so that's the subtle difference you need to understand, is that the repeater, it's not that it says, yes, you will have your data model, it also assigns the repeater behavior to that particular block. Okay. But whenever you assign it as a repeater, it will get its own data model. Therefore, this checkbox becomes redundant. Okay, next question. What is the simplest way to audit or see a snapshot of the existing data models properties in the UI Builder page? To be honest, I'm not sure. Maybe there is a way and we'll find out. But whenever you, to me, this question sounds like, let's say if you are talking about the code, it's like, what is the way to find what classes I have in my application? Well, as a programmer, you really need to know what classes you have in your application, because that becomes the structure of your application if you're writing it with code. In UI Builder, if you're structuring your page and your page has different various zones, and then those zones have their own data models, as a developer, it's really your responsibility to understand how the page is structured and what data models it has. But perhaps there is a way in UI Builder, since it is a React application, and whenever this application runs, if you go into inspect, and then in here you have this React plugin for components, and then there is a React profiler. By going in there, there is a way to actually see the underlying data as React structures it. So for instance, in this case, you see that there is a page and it has the repeater data. For pages that become more complex, and then when you select repeater data, you can actually see what properties it has. So maybe, and then by the way, this repeater data, it has this countries repeater that also has its own properties. So it's going to be somewhere of these lines, but I will find out from the development team if there is a way to inspect it to understand what data models it has. Typically, for someone who is developing, the expectation is you're going to need to know what data models any given page has, because that's really the operational set of information that you're working with. The question is, you mentioned user experience and speed. I'm trying to improve speed on an existing UI Builder page that has become rather complex. What is the workflow or sequence of actions that you recommend doing to improve speed of a UI Builder page? Excellent question. The workflow that I typically would follow is, number one, whenever you open up the page, go to the network tab. Okay, and network tab is where you will see data being loaded. There could be a couple of reasons why a page becomes slow simply just by working through the network tab. If the images are too big and it takes time to load them, if the API requests take time, and thus the page is kind of waiting for the data. Like for instance, if I reload this page, and this is, by the way, preview mode, so many of these requests will be compressed once you publish a page. But in here, if you just select this fetch XHR, these are going to be, among others, primarily API calls. Well, here, the API call, there is only one, find. And in this case, you see this is the API request that brings data. So look for the times that it takes to load. In this case, retrieving 100 countries from the database took 581 milliseconds, which is pretty good. But look for the API calls that are slower and see those. Now, one other thing to watch out. I mentioned that anytime you modify a data model, there is going to be a re-render. Okay. Some properties in UI Builder, and let's just go in here. For instance, the class list logic. Okay. In here, class list logic is going to be invoked every time the underlying data model is modified. So what may happen, and that's highly undesirable and should really not happen in your application, well, unless you actually make a mistake and program it this way. If inside of these guys, you modify the underlying data model, you will be calling recursion, where it will constantly re-render. And as a result, the whole page will become very, very sluggish. I don't think that's what's happening in your application, because otherwise you would know that the whole thing is just dog slow, and there is definitely a problem in there. But typically it is the speed of loading data. And the calculations that are happening to update various parts, but moving logic into out of individual re-renders into the, let's say, higher up on the page when it's being loaded could be one thing that you could do. It's really hard to say, to provide kind of a simple rule that applies to all the cases. Many of them are going to be very specialized to the way things have been implemented. Sometimes removing things from the page and seeing if it helps will help you identify the areas that are responsible for the overall experience for the users being slowing down. So as far as the border, so the comment is that there are no border properties on the container itself. That's correct. So to control borders, okay, what you need to do is use block, okay, because you can put anything into a block. So you put block in here, you can assign border to the block, and then move anything else, container to the block if you need to. So here's my block, and let me just assign, let's say, I'll give it 10 pixel margins just so it stands out and we can see the border a little better. Okay, so this is my block and I will give it a border. So here's a 3 pixel border that is bright green. Okay, so this is my block with border. And now if we want to have a container that has a border, then what you do is you put container inside of this block. And, oh, actually it was reported, I think, in the forum today or yesterday, where if you assign a border to a block and you put container in there, that the border is being wiped out. I think there was an internal ticket created. So yes, you're right. Right now it is not possible to do it through this. Maybe it is possible to do it with CSS. Let me quickly check this. Block border class. All right, so it's block. Oh, so as soon as the class is assigned, then it works. Let me check. There you go. Yeah, so it's in here. So the one way, what you need to do really as a workaround. So create your block, assign the border, put your container in there, and then for the block, just assign a dummy class, and then the border is going to be there. But that workaround that I just discovered really does not need to be there. The border should display. And I think there is an internal ticket that we created either yesterday or today to make it happen. I'm having problems with checking for if certain matching relationships exist, then changing the visibility of another component if the relationship exists or not. So I assume that the question is, how to determine if an object has a relationship that you expect, and then do something with the visibility or rendering of that object. Let me see if I can demonstrate how I would go about this. So for instance, here we have a couple of countries where there is no related capital. So, and I'm not sure if those will be loaded in, but what we will do is we will load countries. Actually, let me go with something simpler, because here, if we get all the ones with the capital, then it will just become complex. So how about, let's see if I have like order, and then order, some orders have customer. Yeah, there you go. That's going to be better. So here we go. We have 4 orders, and then 2 of them have customer relation and 2 don't. Okay, and order A, order B, order C, and that's what we're going to be rendering, order D. Okay, and we will be retrieving data from the order table, and then if customer is there, we will show it with one color, and if the customer is not there, we will show it with another color. How about that? All right, so table order, customer, and name. So let's create a new page, order demo. And in here, we will have a block. That block will be repeater. And inside of this block, we will add, actually misplaced it inside of this. So this text will be bound to name. And this is, we will call it orders, the ID. And in the page, let's retrieve our orders and assign them as the repeater data. So data, load table objects, table name order. And then in the relations, we will add a list with the name of the related property, which is customer. Okay, so this will fetch all the orders with the related customer information. Okay, and in here, if the customer is not there, then we want to highlight that order with a different background color, just like we did with the countries. So in here, if we go into styles, and we will add the check, and the check will be get property customer of the current order. And if it is null, then we will return background color. For instance, blue. Okay, so what we do is for the current order object, we check the property customer, which is the related property. And if it is not there, being null, then we will be highlighting the name of that order with blue. Let's see how that works. There you go. So order B doesn't have customer and order D doesn't have customer. And let's verify this in the database. So order B has no customer, order D has no customer. All right, so hopefully that demonstrates what you wanted to see there. All right, next question. What if you wanted to display more than one country name? What if you wanted to display population as well? How would you do that? Great question. Let's go back to our countries. And that was data binding with logic. All right, so here we have countries repeater, and it has right now one text. Okay, so what we will do is we'll modify our rendering template and put another block inside of this repeater. Now this block will have different direction, and it's going to be left to right. And in here, let's move this text. So this will display name of the country. And in fact, let's set the width to, for instance, 200 pixels. And replicate this guy. And this one will be population, for instance, right? And the data binding for this will be not name, but population. And that's all it is. So now if we render this, let's see what happens. There you go. So now we have name of the countries with the related population. So what I did is inside of my repeater, I modified the template that the repeater uses. And in that template, I put in another block. And the reason it is so we can just remove height to make it more compact. So this block contains two text properties. This one is bound to name. This one is bound to population. And then the rest is automatic because we're already bringing in population from the database. So this is the population. So hopefully that answers your question. That's all we have. Thank you everyone for joining us today and for the questions that you were asking. We will create the recording and upload it to our YouTube. So if you want to revisit, it's going to be on our YouTube channel. And for now, thanks again. Have a great day and see you guys next week.